Welcome back to The Music Folder, the podcast by Archivio Storico Ricordi. I'm Gabriele Marino, I'm a musician, and I'm very happy to have here today Nicolas Jaar. And today we're gonna talk for 1 hour or something like that about sound, music, memory, the idea of heritage, the idea of archive. And so, let's start.
Maybe before we start, I would like to know a little bit more about you, if that's okay.
Yes, definitely.
You say you're a semiotician, so
yes.
It's interesting.
I'm almost 39. I'm from Sicily, but I've been living in Turin and then Milan and then Bologna since 20...
That's water.
Yes, thank you. Since 2011. I used to play the drums when I was younger. And I'm a semiotician, so I don't know if you know what semiotics is, actually.
The study of science?
Yes, the study of science.
Yeah.
So it's something in between a linguistic of non-strictly linguistic forms. For example, we do apply things that come from linguistics to cinema or music, for example. Yeah. But it's also a bit philosophical as a discourse. And so I got stuck into semiotics. It's like benign pathology, because once you got into it, you see everything in a certain fashion. And so I'm doing this in university as a researcher in Turin, and I teach music semiotics, which is not something musicological or analytical. It's much more on the how meaning making works with music and how communities assign meaning to music. For example, I worked a lot with the notion of genre, which is something that I enjoy a lot, and I think it's a focal topic for discussing music. That's it. I know you because I used to write a lot of music reviews for a website called Sentire Ascoltare. It's one of the magazines that we have here in Italy. It's Bologna based, but it's a national one. And so I discovered your music in 2011, obviously. And then I followed your career for some while. I come from, I'd say, musical education focused on stuff like Frank Zappa and rock from the 60s. But then I discovered electronic music, electronic dance music, and so it was like a second birth for me. And so here I am.
Wonderful. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for asking. Actually, I think it's good to do a little introduction before delving directly into the things that we...
Absolutely.
Yes.
I could also give you an introduction of who I am.
Yes, definitely. Because
because we've never met as people.
Yes, I studied a little bit, but I want to know your own version of your own biography or profile or something like that.
I guess I've been making music since I was about 14 years old. I started with GarageBand, which is that, low entry point software that is now, I think, pretty good, actually. But back then it was just, you could layer sounds. Actually, no, before that I used iMovie in order to layer sounds. So I was always interested in layering sounds. And then at one point I started listening to... I went to the studio of some photographer in Chile that I'm forgetting his name now. I went with my parents, and he was playing a DJ Kicks mix by Tiga. I was 14, and I was like, what is this? I love this music. And I told my father, I love electronic music. Can you get me a CD of electronic music? And we were in Chile at the time, and he went to a music store, and he asked the people, what's the best electronic music that came out this year? What's the best CD? And they gave him Teorème d'Archimède by Ricardo Villalobos. And I listened to that, and I thought, it's not so interesting. I didn't like it so much. But when I was listening to it, my mother came into the room and said, Nico, that's fantastic, you should keep on listening to that. So my parents are actually very important. I was very privileged to have parents that were very forthcoming about, just giving me a lot of inspiration and room for this. I didn't make club music until I met a label in the US called Wolf and Lamb, and I sent them a demo, and they told me, we like the song, but you need to put a kick drum on it. And so I said, okay, why not? I love making music. Until then I had just been making music in the street, playing accordion with my sax player, a friend, and a bass player. So for me, the idea of putting music out in a label was just so exciting. And they said, okay, put a kick drum on it and maybe we put out your song. I said, okay, I love it. I put some percussion on it and they put out the first single. And that led me down a whole path, let's say, of making dance music. I had never been to a club. I had not been actually knowledgeable of anything about clubbing. I only knew L'Uomo, which is, L'Uomo, L'Uomo, Vocal City, that album. I knew Teorem d'Archimède by Ricardo. I knew Alcachofa by Ricardo because after I liked Teorem d'Archimède so much, I listened to more. I liked that DJ Kicks by Tiga, and at the time I started listening to maybe Trentemolo a little bit later. And
so just a few references actually.
Very few references. For me, my bigger inspirations were coming from elsewhere. They were not in dance music. But because of the way things happened, I was placed in a club context from a very young age, before even going to being able to legally go to clubs in the US, and started playing in clubs. I was lucky to be kind of found by a booking agency in Berlin very early on, and I was in that, let's say, mode for a couple of years or 3 years or so. Finally, at around all of that time, I was still making music that was not club based, as I had always done, and I was finally able to put out a record called Space Is Only Noise in 2011, which was not exactly club music. It was all of the different things that I liked at the time. And that ended up putting me in this strange situation where some people knew me for the club stuff and some people knew me for the albums, which were a little bit different. And that kind of duality, I think, has just somehow continued until 2017, where I decided that I would stop working formally inside of the music business. I left New York. At the time, I had to fire everyone that I was working with, and I moved to Torino.
Yes, I remember that.
And I largely stopped making a lot of music. Started writing a little bit, and ever since, I've been managing myself and doing everything on a much more independent level, and kind of starting again, really. I mean, quite literally starting again. I just started playing live solo in September of last year, doing mostly shows in my own tiny apartment in Berlin, and then also outside in Cafe Otto in London, for example, and other places. And so, yeah, it's been a kind of story where I entered this kind of path, and then at some point had to quite literally throw myself out of it, and now in a way kind of coming back to music and coming back to even doing things like this, which I'm not used to be honest.
Okay.
But I'm happy to do it. It's just again, I stopped doing this for a really long time.
But actually you stopped doing things, but you started doing other things. For example, in 2015 or something like that, I tried to reconstruct the origin in time. You started getting involved in teaching music, doing workshops, mentoring students on music, sound, and this is another way of doing music and working with music, completely different from performance or recording. But I have the feeling that actually you do not detach the two things, the two areas. So there is a kind of connection between you as a producer, as an artist, and you as a teacher. And I wanted to know what's your view, what's your perspective on teaching music as a practice?
Yeah, thank you for asking me that question. Yeah, it's been completely, I guess, perspective shifting to start teaching. I think when you are making music all the time or really doing anything all the time, there's a lot of blind spots that you end up having because it's something you do every day, and therefore it's the same street you walk, and you might not notice that there's a beautiful stone on the side of the road. You might have noticed it the first time, but you don't see it anymore. And when you teach, you are forced to really sit on the side of the road and take a look at the street and say, well, how can I walk this street with someone? And it's completely, for me, it has been life-changing. I mean, I know it's extreme to say it, but it really has been. And I teach mainly sound editing software. Sometimes it'll delve more into the politics of sound and all of the different things that might mean. Of course, in different contexts, that will mean very different things. You know, I've taught in Santiago in Chile, in the Museum of Memory, which has an archive a sonic archive from the dictatorship years. So there, that will mean something, and we will be talking about certain things. Teaching in Bethlehem in Palestine, very different, but also, the context there will completely change the way that we might think of all kinds of sounds. And so I don't necessarily see, I guess, any kind of, solid, I guess, curriculum. You know what I mean, or way that I'm trying to, enter a room and have something to say. I don't have anything to say. I don't have anything to teach, really. The first time, every time that I go and I'm asked to do this, I sit down and we just listen, all of us, to each other, to sounds that we like, that we might have brought. And that is where I start actually writing a syllabus for the class. So this is very important to me as far as the practice itself, which is it is born from the relationship between the students and our context within that place. And that has also been an incredible teaching to me, teaching opportunity to me. I mean, it has taught me so much. There's something that is often said when people talk about teaching to this day it still kind of really hits me, which is that you really teach what you need to learn. And I have felt that to the core, that there are certain things that I really needed to learn again that I was forgetting. Yeah.
When one would listen to your records, you can feel that there is a strong focus on the idea of creating ambiences, textures, that you can almost feel in a haptic way, that you can also try and imagine to touch. And this is something that fills the acoustic space, obviously. So actually I wanted to ask the very opposite thing, which is your relationship, if you have a relationship with silence.
I think silence is completely dependent on a context. Silence right now, we are silent to, well, we could say that bird just made a sound. That bird was not silent. But we could also say that we could say we are in silence now. But what does this silence really mean? It's the hum of all of these computers, of this microphone. These computers are the products of mining in different parts of the world that create all kinds of violence for people and for let's say human and non-human beings. So what does this silence here really mean? It is definitely not silence elsewhere. Also, what is the, let's say, relative safety and silence of this room here in these archives? How much money is this worth, this silence that we get to experience? And what other places have to be extremely loud for this silence to exist? And for us to have the privilege of a little bird being the only thing that stands out from this silence. So I would say my relationship to silence goes more towards that direction, which is that, at least from this position right now, from two people speaking here in a European capital or important European city, silence will mean certain things.
It's a kind of privilege.
It can be, yeah. But it can also be, it can be a privilege. It can also be the privilege of not saying right now that there's a genocide happening in Gaza committed by the Israeli government. If I hadn't said that, maybe that would be some kind of, silent privilege, or the silence of comfort, not having to deal with that, not having to bring that into our conversation. That could be a silence. But you could see it the opposite way as well. I'm sure, there's all kinds of ways of bringing it the other way around. People without certain privileges are silenced. They're not given a platform to speak, and therefore silence then becomes this opposite thing. And we could think of it, we could look at it on that political level and say, okay, let's categorize that as the political nature of silence and put it away. But can you ever put politics just away on the side and keep it in a neat box? No, right? And therefore, any other kind of silence that might be related to the idea of silence will have to deal with those, let's say, dimensions or layers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if we speak about, more esoteric conceptions of silence, right? Are they devoid of the other political implications? They can't be. How could they be? Can we really say that we can divide things so easily? And so I'm interested in these fluxes, right, of meanings that have sometimes very disrespectful, let's say, relationships between each other, or uncomfortable, let's say, relationships between each other. They really are, what is this called?
I don't know what to say.
Yeah, I don't know either, but it's in Spanish frotando, como así, no sé. But
they're washing their hands. They're
no, not washing their hands. No. I'm saying literally that sound. Two things.
But there is a friction between.
Friction is the word. Thank
Okay.
you. Friction is the word that I was looking for. That there's a friction between different definitions constantly. This is also part of reality, right? That the multiple definitions of an idea, of a term, there will be friction between them, and that friction to me is more interesting than the
thing itself.
Than the thing itself sometimes, because that friction ultimately gives us a rhythm, and that's a rhythm that I'm interested in understanding, and not even understanding actually, but maybe just trembling with,
When we speak, we talk a language, but at the same time we are talked in turn by this language, because we have that language is our horizon of possibility, but at the same time is our boundaries, is our limits. So putting together cognitively but also culturally speaking different perspectives on the world, which are different languages, should have some consequences, for example, on creativity or your political view on very different things. So I wanted to ask you, how do you judge? How would you regard as important or not the fact that you are culturally syncretic, maybe? But starting off with the idea that you speak different languages, and so you have different access point to the world, because a language is a thing such as these.
I first learned Spanish, then because my father spent 10 years in Martinique, and my mother, her father is French, They met in a French school, so they put me in a French school in Chile. French was my second language, then English was my third language when I arrived to New York. Then there's all the languages I speak terribly, and we won't name those. But I'm very interested by one aspect of your question, which was that language will define the realm of possibility. I think this is potentially, I don't know whether that's a theory which we can demonstrably say, hey, that's true or not. But let's take it as just the foundation for the next thing. If that's true, then I think or if that's one possibility, then I'm really interested in the idea, then I'm very interested in non-verbal communication, because that will therefore create a different horizon of possibility. So will music, of course, which is non-verbal to a certain extent, depends. But also so will silence. So will walking. So will the contemplation of a tree throughout 3-4 years. Those relationships will have their own horizons of possibilities. And I don't want to be like a grumpy grandpa about this at the moment, but I do feel like we're very much in a time where the horizon of possibility is video, image, text, and the format that our phones and maybe our computers give us. And although that's an incredible range of possibilities, as we know, we can feel all kinds of things, there's obviously also so much more. And I think when I think about range of possibility, that is something where actually live music for me is having such an interesting I think can have such an interesting effect, because there is a lot that you can say, a lot that you can feel from the whole range of, I guess, kind of relationships that one forms within the concert space. Even calling it the concert space is actually getting rid of some part of the horizon of possibility that could exist there, right? I feel like I didn't explain this as well as I could. I'm sorry. I was a bit...
No, I think you were interested in this specific part of my question, which regarded the idea that within a given language you had a horizon of possibility, but that concept was maybe much more interesting for you besides language. And this straightly goes to another thing that I think it's interesting, because when you have the possibility to talk about a musician's view on his music and beyond, obviously, I think that the relationship with words and the relationship between words and sound, so non-linguistic sound, it's a key point. And for example, you just said if you call a situation a concert, you are scratching off a lot of other possibilities. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to ask you, how do you feel about categories? What's your view on the idea of getting linguistic labels so as to give order to things, but also definitely to give a limitation to things, because a definition is by definition a limit, a semantic limit. So silence is this, and you have the definition. Also because, for example, since your music is really diverse and eclectic, and you are producing music since several years by now, people writing about your music use categories and terms and adjectives in order to describe it that maybe would not fit your own view on your own music. For example, recently in his book about future music, the idea of futuromania, Simon Reynolds wrote that some of your things are maximalist or progtronic, which are two labels that I would not put next to the things that you do. And so I was just thinking about what's your view on categories, on labels that we are forced to use in order to, for example, translate the experience of contemplating a tree across 3 years. You have some feelings, but then you have put them into words in order to communicate them to other people.
Well, if a critic, like the person you mentioned, wants to put a label, like maximalist, for example, to someone's music, then I think that says much more about the critic than about what the music is. The critic is choosing to see maximalism in a piece of music. I think in any situation you could definitely have someone else who would say that they thought that was a very minimalist piece. And so it ultimately is, I think, a bit of a mirror of the needs and the desires of the people using the categories. So I prefer concentrating on that fact, the desire for category, than whether the category is true or not.
Again, okay.
I can't help it, because I think that desire shows us a larger system, a system that is connected to levels of maybe theoretical ownership, or the idea of understanding as limiting. I mean, that's so interesting, right? How and why would understanding be to limit the thing itself? Why wouldn't understanding mean to let the thing be everything that it can be, and therefore not to limit it? Why is understanding so often, in certain parts of the world, linked to a categorization of things? Now, of course, I could look at it in different ways, and I would be very interested, since you said that I'm sure you would have a very interesting, potentially alternative way of looking at this, and I'm very curious to hear it.
About categories, yes.
I mean, you said you were interested in it, so.
I'm interested in music genres exactly for this very reason, because I think that to a certain extent we are forced, we need them in order to deal with reality. But obviously this is a problem. This is something that creates friction, because, for example, when you meet someone and you say, "Oh, what you listen to?" "I listen to dubstep." "Ah, okay, Skrillex." "No, I listen to James Blake, I listen to Mount Kimby and other stuff like Code 9. So the idea that you use these large umbrella terms, for example, like music genre, is something that we cannot get rid of easily, but at the same time is definitely a problem. And this is just regarding music genres. We can say the very same thing, applying that to any kind of human experience, because genre as category, class, type, is something that we use for everything, from the groceries to gender to religion. So it's a really complex issue, and it's a way in which we find ready-made ways of doing things. Because if you go to the cinema in order to see a comedy, you know how to behave, you know how to what you gonna see, so your expectations are set in a certain way. It's a kind of shortcut. If you didn't know the genre of the movie, you are forced to be much more open. You are forced not to have a preset way of behaving or understanding what you're watching. So I have no specific position, but I guess that I would agree on the idea that our definitions should be, because culture works in this way, should be open. For example, to things that are as verb, a deviation from the norm, for metabolical reasons regarding culture, because culture works in this way.
It's a nice Fisherian use of metabolic.
Yes. I'm very curious about. You said Fisherian. If you read a lot of things from fiction to non-fiction, that could be related to the sphere of theory in general, and how these readings affect your vision in general, also besides music, but maybe also within music.
Yeah, it's hard to kind of explain like what one reads, because one is reading all the time. Like right now, I've been reading the titles of these books that are behind me, and I always love the idea that you can form a poem from the titles of the books if you just read them from left to right or right to left. And there's, a bunch of text in this cup, and there's text in the back of your laptop, right? Yeah. So we define reading often as a very particular kind of, what are you reading? Well, what does that mean? You're reading books. It's immediately, what are you reading at the moment? Well, I'm reading this book or that book. It's not, well, I spend my whole day reading signs on the street. I spend my whole day reading labels on food items.
It's the very same practice, but maybe in different genres, actually. Yes, I want to ask you, what's your view on the relationship between tradition and innovation? Because on the one hand, there should be a certain degree of things that are static, things that stay, things that stand. But on the other hand, it is necessary for a community, for any culture, for new things to come in. Otherwise, the culture itself and then the community that produces this culture is going to be crystallized and dispersed and to die eventually. So there should be a circular movement between the inside and the outside, between things that are consolidated and maybe old and maybe traditional, also in the between quotation marks, in the worst way. But on the other hand, there should be something new to be put inside the system in order to make it possible for it to exist. So my view, and I'm curious to know your position about that. My view is that tradition and innovation are not necessarily the two opposite poles of a continuum, because you can see innovation as an organic extension of tradition. And this also concerns, for example, music genres. You can say that you do jazz music, but you're working, for example, on Ableton. On the contrary, you can state that you are doing something different because you do not feel to belong to a given tradition, so you use another way of describing it. So how do you feel that the dichotomy, the opposition, at least the opposition that it's generally assigned to these two terms, tradition and innovation, and so where to put the idea of heritage, which is something you are working on, you are constantly eliciting in your in the things that you say, in the interviews, in your statements?
That's a big question. That's a hard question, and you said a lot of things that it's like I want to rewind and kind of comment on. The first thing that I felt, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to explain it because it's not very clear in my mind yet, is that you created this dichotomy between the traditions that a culture creates for itself that have to be somewhat static in order for them to be a culture or defined in any way as a, right? And then the new things. And for some reason my mind went immediately to bacteria and the fact that our bodies are filled with all kinds of bacteria. They're constantly moving. They're being exchanged when we eat something, when we kiss someone, all kinds of things. So there's this, absolute kind of microscopic flux and constant change that is happening on a, let's say, microbial level. And I was thinking, well, what is this need for even just the definition of static, the static? What is the static when even on a bacterial level, that staticness, it is not happening. The staticness is not happening when it comes to, you can't look at a cloud and say, that is one cloud. It just maybe an hour ago was a part of another cloud. Which one is the cloud? And so I'm not trying to be difficult or anything with that. It's just that this is precisely what actually makes me tick a bit.
Mm-hmm.
It's the fact that we can try to see, the gods in the clouds, let's say. Those myths are very beautiful, and part of what we are as humans. We need to see things in the clouds. But the clouds are constantly moving, and they're never static. And just because it happened that all of us saw in the clouds a horse, doesn't mean that tomorrow the horse will be killed. And it doesn't mean actually that the cloud was that image of the horse for even more than 10 minutes. So again, I feel it's interesting, this idea of tradition and the new penetrating it somehow, as if those two things are somehow can even for a second be separated. How can they be separated, truly? So that is my question, and it's actually something that excites me a lot. And in a lot of the music that I make, which is generative, these are exactly the reasons why. These are the kinds of conversations and thoughts, let's say, that make me excited about music. Let's say that the possibility of creating these completely ever-changing, non-repeatable patterns and sounds.
You were addressing briefly the idea that you took your time and took a rest from producing, from doing gigs. And so this happened in 2017, and you were in touring also. And you started, for example, maybe concentrating more on writing. Or you continued writing, maybe, just that. And actually, you recently published your first collection of short stories, which were published for the first time in Italian. And maybe you wrote them in Spanish, I guess. No, in English, okay. And the title is Islands, Isole. And there is this image that you chose, maybe was a necessary one, islands. Because, for example, in philosophy, it's a really powerful subject matter, the island is really powerful. There are a lot of philosophers from Thomas More and Utopia to Peter Sloterdijk and again Deleuze. They worked a lot on the idea of island. So, also because I found a review by an English journalist on The Guardian in 2016, something like that, where this guy said about your music that it had this insular aesthetic, okay? And this is interesting because when I got to know about the publishing of the book in Italian, I said, yes, islands, it's obvious, it makes sense with Nicolas Jaar's music. And so, do you feel this kind of insular nuance in your aesthetic, in your way of doing music, in your philosophy?
What does insular mean?
Insular, that the image of an island is a good metaphor for your understanding of the world could be. So the idea of being, on the one hand, detached from other places, but necessarily forced to be in contact, for example, with other places. And so to be, I don't know how to say it in English, accogliente, to be, to include from the outside. And so to be open to things that come from the outside. Is there any fascination, any specific fascination with this image, this philosophical image, maybe also of the island?
Do you know, it's hard to pinpoint at what stage it made sense to call it islands and to give it a deeper meaning than the fact that all of the stories happen in islands. You know, I think that is some aspect of what brought those particular stories together from a larger batch of stories. So when with the editors we were looking at the bigger batch of stories, we were like, well, these are all happening in islands. And it started from there. Now, the fascination with the island itself, I think it's very interesting. A lot of what you're saying, I haven't thought through it like this. I don't write with a kind of with some kind of manifesto in mind or some philosophical thing. You know, it's you know, when I moved to Torino, I moved there because of the Po. I fell in love with that river. To this day, I think about the Po, and it's in front of the Po that I started writing. And so, actually, I find it so poetic and beautiful in my own ridiculous myth-making that I'm doing for myself in this moment that it came out in Italian first, because I started writing it in Italian. I mean, sorry, in Italy. I started writing it in front of the Po in Torino. Of course, I didn't write the whole thing here, and etc., etc. But the fact that it is water and the proximity to a constantly flowing stream that allowed for the music, allowed for the book, for the writing. I'm so used to talking and doing interviews about music that I don't even...
We are constantly overlapping the things. So.
Exactly. But yeah, I think maybe, you know, because water had already so much to do with the genesis of, you know, these stories even existing, maybe it was only natural that we would end up in, you know, those bodies of water that are bodies of earth that are surrounded by bodies of water. Now, I mean, in a sense, we're, of course, islands. We're made of earth and water and many other things. And yeah, I've heard, some people have told me, I actually did another interview, I think yesterday, and they mentioned that, you know, they said something similar in regards to islands, and they said, oh, it's the troubles in communication, as if we're all in islands. And it seems to be something that people are grabbing onto that I did not grab onto when I was writing it. It's not, it wasn't this very obvious thing to me. Yeah.
Last couple of questions that are really contextual, because you are here in Milan and you are going to play Jeremias, and my view on this gig, this artistic enterprise, is twofold. On the one hand, there is the interesting fact that you are not going to play solo. You are going to play solo, but you are going to interact with all the other things that are yes, François Couperin, Nicolas Jaar, Ardis Cantica, yes. And what I wanted to ask you is the intertextual relationship between all these things, namely the Bible book, the lessons, les leçons de François de Couperin, and the voices of Ardis Cantica. How did you deal with all of these things? Did you materially interact with these sources, or you made your own view on Jeremias?
So I'm in the process right now of every day we're going to the church and listening to the space and making music for the space. So there's that. It's again very much based on the sound of the space. As far as the François Couperin work, I listened to it on YouTube and was very moved by it. It's really powerful and definitely very intimidating to be playing right after or before that, of course. The other aspect of this is the father Antonio Pileggi, who I've had a long kind of discussion with in regards to Jeremiah, and in regards to how we should collaborate. The Father Antonio is the person who curates Inner Spaces, which is the series in which I'm playing in. And so it's a combination of interpersonal conversations, doing a little bit of the research of what else is playing, and also very much being in the room, being in the room and dealing with the question for me always is, how can we let the space itself speak? And so, for example, just to give you an example, because I know that sounds like some theoretical thing or whatever, or it might even sound new agey, but high frequencies inside of that church make it so that you have a very clear directionality when it comes to the speaker. You hear the speaker itself when you have high frequencies on them. The second you take out the high frequencies from those speakers, then it feels like the sound is coming from the space itself. That is the approach that I'm interested in. I don't want the speakers to, in a sense, have any protagonism.
Any room in all of these?
Well, they're there, they're important, but what's really important is for the space to have a relationship with the speakers and to kind of almost accept them. And the high frequencies in that room, they're not necessarily accepted, or maybe they are accepted, but it's very clear that the space says, look at the speaker, look at the high frequencies that are coming out of it. And so that's the kind of conversation and relationship with this project. But again, all of this sounds maybe a bit overly conceptual when it comes down to it. It just means spending time, putting
in the place,
putting yourself there and listening. There's nothing else. And actually, if I try to do less interviews in general and whatever, it's because it's a lot of speaking.
Okay.
When for me, a lot of this is not only doing, but also being in the place, listening, and seeing what comes out of it. Whereas speaking often involves a kind of reconceptualization, putting into categories certain things that might not even need to be there. But I also kind of enjoy it. There's a kind of sick joy to it.
That's what I wanted to discuss with you. Actually, all of this is not so new agey. Not to me.
No, not to me either. But yes. It can be seen that way.
Yes, definitely, because there is a method behind all of this. For example, Butch Morris, the guy who invented this methodology of putting together improvisation and written music, called conduction, said that conduction was the art of environing, the art of making the environment in all its ecological nuances and senses to speak. It was a way of doing music in a workshop context with musicians he never met. So there is this idea of eliciting music from the very place.
In terms of, this is a parenthesis, just because I got excited.
Yes.
Pierce is very interesting, and when we think about the Umwelt and all of these, theorists thinking through speech, sound from non-human perspectives, and what is even the Umwelt, and of who, of what. We could even extend it to the extent of speaking about the Umwelt of the church itself. These are just questions. It was just to throw something of excitement. I don't have any answers.
Thank you so much for saying that, because I was saying ecological approach precisely because I wanted to crypto suggest the Umwelt thing. It's super interesting. It's super interesting for what you do. It's no coincidence that among the things that could be semiotic, this got your attention, because it's perfectly. It does fit. It does fit with working in a given place with sounds, which is totally a neglect type of sign and stuff like that. My last curiosity is about the spiritual nuances that one may find in your production? Because I think that one can find a spiritual nuance which is, I would say, pantheistic, something like that, really related to the very materiality of the world. So it's an immanent spirituality. Do you feel that it makes sense or not? It's a deconstruction of what you do without an injection of too many theory, or maybe it's something that works for you?
These are really hard questions, and I'm enjoying it. I'm just saying it's hard to come up with answers to this. I'm going to try my best and to keep it also very quick, but in terms of a kind of pantheistic, let's say immanent perspective in the world, I think yes, maybe ultimately I connect with that view on many levels. I also connect with the myths that bring people together in communion with, let's say, God for
brevity.
For brevity. I'm just as interested in this kind of hyper theoretical philosophical understanding of God. It's hard to just say the word God, but it's okay. I'm gonna just breathe through it and deal with the fact that I'm speaking in those terms. But I'm very interested in that, but I'm also interested in the fact that we create social rituals, common myths, in order for a collaborative assembly where we can experience God together. And often, I don't know, and if someone does, please tell me, I don't know where the immanent communion is taking place. I have not yet met that community. I have maybe met it in very new agey spaces that I don't feel so comfortable with, let's say. But I have felt incredible beauty in certain, I call them mythological spaces, whether it is of a particular religion or not, that might speak to that immanence, but through all kinds of, let's say, clouds that are intercepting those rays of light that might blind us.
So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
It's been super nice for me to have the possibility to talk about all of this.
Thank you.
And also thanks to the guys who are going to listen to this episode.
Let's hope it records.
Let's hope it's recorded of the music folder. Let's see.